Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I hope that you all are good and well and healthy, inshallah. Welcome to our The Past, Present, and the Future of Islamic Psychology program that is prepared by Ibn Haldun University Ibn Haldun University Psychology Club and Islamic Civilization Club, and with the sponsorship of Khalil Center. And today we have some people, brothers and sisters beyond Ibn Haldun University. It's really great to see you. Welcome again. I'm Fatma Zehra, the first year student of psychology department in Ibn Haldun University and the secretary of the psychology club. Hiba and I will be moderating the program, inshallah. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to our guests for accepting our invitation. Today we have Dr. Rothman and Dr. Human Kesharwazi from Ibn Haldun University with us. And welcome again.
Thank you.
And it's really great honor to have you, especially in that field, Islamic psychology. Before the program, let me briefly talk about the program flow. First of all, Hiba will be introducing our guest to us. And then we will be listening to, firstly, the past of Islamic psychology and the present, current time of Islamic psychology. And our both guest speakers will be speaking about the future of Islamic psychology. And then we will ask our questions. You are welcome to ask your questions. Please write your questions on chat. So we will be directing your questions to our speakers. Yeah, Hiba, if you want, you can continue.
Thank you very much, Fatma Zahra. Assalamu alaikum. I'll say assalamu alaikum too. We're very happy to have all the participants and the professor, like Dr. Human and Dr. Abdullah, because as you will see now from the introduction, both of them are students of Malik Badri, rahmatullah alayh, may Allah have mercy on him. And Malik Badri is considered to be the pioneer, actually, of Islamic psychology, of modern Islamic psychology as it exists now. And both of our doctors were very closely connected to him. So Human Keshavrazi is licensed as a psychotherapist in the state of Illinois, if I'm not mistaken in the pronunciation. And he's a visiting scholar at our university, Ibn Haldun University. And he is the founder and the executive director of Khalil Center, which, as far as I know, is the most prominent, Islamic psychology center that exists in terms of offering psychotherapy and connected to mental illness, mental wellness, and community mental wellness, basically. It's the first and the largest provider of Muslim mental health care in the US, as it writes. And of course, Dr. Ruthman as well is a student and closely connected psychotherapist to Dr. Malik Badri. He's also a licensed psychotherapist in the United States. He's also, both of our doctors have both their masters and PhDs in clinical psychology. So they're very professional in the field of clinical psychology. And I guess, we will now give the floor to them. Also, Fatma Zahra wants to mention Malik Badri, Professor Malik Badri. May Allah have mercy on him.
Yeah, thank you, Hiba. And as you mentioned, and I'm gonna remind you and to remember Dr. Malik Badri, may Allah have mercy upon him, thanks to this program, who is the father of the modern Islamic psychology. We have lost him a short time ago with deep grief, actually, since he has quite huge contribution in that field. So Islamic psychology. Actually, I don't want to take your time because we have two special guests, and just I want to mention him, and I hope and believe after the program we can understand more his contribution in that field also. then let us begin with the past of the Islamic psychology with the Dr. Huma.
Thank you, Jazakallah khair. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi wahda wa salatu wa salamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I hope you're all having a good evening or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from, or good afternoon, in fact, if you're in England, I imagine. I'm very happy to be a part of this program and to also share the floor with Dr. Rothman, a good friend and colleague that we've developed a good friendship over the years, and to be with all of you at Ibn Khaldun as well and beyond. I congratulate the students, the club. You actually did a lot more than I expected. You were advertising this program pretty well, mashallah, because I just anticipated a handful of students from Ibn Khaldun joining on, but mashallah, we ended up putting together a really good program. It looks like it's being live on YouTube with a number of people there that I can't see, but there's a lot of people on the Zoom platform. So great success, mashallah. Hopefully you've done your work and we'll do our job to hopefully to make it a true success, inshallah. So what I wanted to focus on was the past, the history, and in particular, I want to speak about the history of the Islamic intellectual heritage as it pertains to the subject matter of psychology. So the Islamic intellectual heritage is very rich. It started obviously from the time of the Prophet ﷺ until now. It's a continuous and living tradition. And I think we want to demonstrate that continuity by me talking about more of the past, the classical scholarly tradition, and then with Dr. Rothman heading into the space of more of the contemporary discussions around Islamic psychology today, more of the recent past. And hopefully we can see that there's this continuity of Muslims always thinking about and writing about and producing content as it pertains to the subject matter of psychology. And that our tradition is one that goes far back and is continuous. So I'm going to share my slide. Okay, so first off, I just want to start with the notion of epistemology. It's very important before we get into looking at the writings of the Islamic intellectual heritage and scholars that we understand the way that they operated, their epistemology. This question is about how do we understand what information is admissible in any science? How do we consider something to be a science or valid information or true knowledge? Okay, and so if we look at the field here, psychology, you can really put anything there. You can put law, you can put anything, social sciences, etc., sociology, and you'll end up with the same epistemological framework in which the Muslim scholars in the Islamic intellectual heritage has relied upon in order to produce that heritage. One of which is the most obvious one, which comes through reports, truthful reports. And it's beyond the scope of my conversation today to get really in detail about the notion of reports. I think there's a lot of modern applicability to the notion of khabar and corroboration and verification of information through reports, because there's the notion of a subjective self-report now that we have in psychology, which is a kind of the main staple in which we rely on for any form of information and knowledge production. So that's a topic for a different day, but there's revelation, in which these truthful reports not only give us information about some realities in the world that people have witnessed, but also realities like wahi, the existence of Allah Ta'ala, and the messengers that brought scripture for us. So that informs our psychology. Empirical knowledge, in which there is an observation or sensation and observations of the world around us, and then a determination and of that to be true knowledge and then admitted into the field. And then the third of which would be rational information, which usually you have the rules of logic that kind of play here. How do we know, for example, and we'll talk about in a moment, actually I'll demonstrate to you an example of that rational one in a moment, inshallah. And the style in which I want to speak today is really more of reading directly from excerpts of the scholarly tradition. I'm just drawing some excerpts of different scholars of the past and how they've talked about topics today that are within the field of psychology. And by doing that and reading directly, I feel that there's a barakah and metaphysical connection back to the works itself, of being able to be connected in this tradition, and B, to let them speak for themselves, and C, for you to see a concrete demonstration rather than saying to you, trust me, Muslims wrote about psychology and we had these great institutions and projects and we had philosophers and we had mutakallimin, kalam scholars, scholastic theologians, etc. I just want to give you some of their words directly for you to be able to start to get a little flavor. And obviously in a very short time, we're not going to be able to get into a whole lot, but just a little bit of a flavor of the Islamic intellectual heritage and the subject of psychology. So one might wonder, oh, well, you know, psychology is a very new phenomenon. It's a new term. And, you know, Muslim scholars didn't really talk about the notion of psychology. And, you know, here is an example of that idea to actually be proven false, because from Ibn Hazm, who is an Andalusian scholar from the Muslim Spain, he has written a book called Maratib al-Ulum, the categories or classification of the types of knowledge, and then he kind of describes each form of knowledge. And in this work, he, in one section, he describes tib and medicine, okay? And he says ilm al-tib yanqasimu qismayn. He says that ilm al-tib, the knowledge of medicine, is broken down into two categories or two types. One of which is tib al-nafs, which is the science of the psyche or soul. Okay, I like to use the word psyche here, particularly in tibbi works and medical works, because it fits most analogously to our modern day notions of psychology, or the term rather. But just very importantly, just keep in mind that when they refer to nafs, and I'm translating as psyche, I mean to say that metaphysical part of ourselves, that's a metaphysical essence, okay? وهو من نتيجة علم المنطق بإصلاح الأخلاق ومداوتها, and that it is the result of the not rational sciences in بإصلاح الأخلاق, in correcting and reforming character and treating it, and وصرفها عن الإفراط والتقصير وإقامتها على الاعتدال, and transforming it or shifting it away from excesses or deficiencies and maintaining it upon balance, upon moderation, okay? Now, you might wonder, well, how is this rational, derived rationally? Well, there's a whole discussion that's very long, but the short of it is that they define human beings as al-insanu hayawanun natiq, that a human being is a animal, but a intelligent animal, okay? Nutq, he speaks, but he has intelligence. He has a faculty of reason, okay? And they say that, and logically, they say that this is the separation, the fasl, the separation between the animals, between the regular animals and humans. Okay, so they're all part of one genus, but the separating factor from the rest of animals, the distinguishing characteristic of human beings, is their knowledge, is their reason. And so since they are reasonable, right, that human beings have this faculty of reason, then they should not live like animals live, which is just through consumption, eating and drinking and just kind of occupying space. but rather they say that this indicates rationally and logically that human beings are elevated, that they have some sort of superiority in the animal kingdom. And on the basis of this intellect, what they need to do then is to use this intellect in order to develop lofty characteristics and to suppress their carnal desires. Okay, so that's an example of how they're using reason and rationality and the sciences and tools of reason to be able to come to this conclusion. And by the way, Ibn Hazm is giving a descriptive definition. It's not prescriptive. What do I mean by that? He's describing the way that the science of medicine operates, the knowledge of medicine that is oftentimes derived through rational sources. Even though they accept metaphysics, they don't reject revelation, but its predominant source they're relying on is reason and empirics, okay? Now, when we look at Ghazali kind of turns, takes this, and I want us to appreciate this as an example of a possibility of what we could be doing in psychology. Now, I think Abdullah will talk about some of that in his talk in the contemporary time, but then when we come to the future, I want you to really keep this in the back of your mind. Imam al-Ghazali tackles the issue of nature versus nurture, and he similarly talks about the notion of i'tidal, of balance, okay? And how an individual needs to balance themselves and develop virtuous characteristics. What you see in Imam al-Ghazali is that he is a theologian, he is a Sufi, he's a polymath, but what he does is he takes the discussions of tib and medicine and the philosophers, and he adds and he sifts or compares or corroborates that which is corroborated with revelation and retains that information which is true. You'll see this demonstrated in his epistemology right here in this paragraph. That's why I highlighted it. So he says, فَرَدُّ الْغَضَبِ وَالشَّهْوَةِ إِلَى حَدِّ الْإِعْتِدَالِ. So to return the disposition of anger and desire or appetite to the stage of moderation. We need to make it moderate. And according to the philosophers and Ghazali, by moderating your desires, by balancing them, you end up with virtue, okay? And he says it's mumkin, it's possible, okay? And he's addressing also two things. He's demonstrating to us how to get virtue, that's number one. And he's doing it through the tools of his epistemology. And B, he's discussing the notion of nature versus nurture, this debate. Is it possible to change character or not? Or is it biologically ingrained? Are we predetermined through our DNA in order to act a certain way? So he says, وَبِالرِّيَاضَةِ تَعُودُ إِلَى حَدِّ الْإِعْتِدَالِ. By exertion, by spiritual exertions, we can bring it to the state of moderation. فَدَلَّ أَنَّ ذَلِكَ مُمْكِنٌ. And he's دُلَّ أَنَّ ذَلِكَ مُمْكِنٌ. And he says, this is possible to do. And I want you to pay attention to this. What is the evidence that he's giving for claiming that it is possible to change human character and that we're not predetermined? He says, وَالتَّجْرَبَةُ وَالْمُشَاهَدَةُ تَدُلُّ عَلَى ذَلِكَ دَلَالَةً لَا شَكَّ فِيهَا. That he says tajraba, which is experiential trials, kind of pre the empirical model today, but we can say their empiricism of their day. Wal mushahada, and observation, gives proof upon this in such a manner that cannot be rejected, that they leaves no shadow of doubt. Okay, so he establishes this by virtue of what? Empirics and reason. But doesn't stop there. This is what makes Imam Ghazali really incredible of a scholar, right? He goes on and he says, we can accept this empirically. We can accept this notion and we can bring it into, and you see all of these notions being brought into the ihya everywhere. Ghadab and shahwa and the analogies and gaining moderation. But then he says, but this is also something that is corroborated by religion, by scripture. وَالَّذِي يَدُلُّ عَلَىٰ أَنَّ الْمَطْلُوبَ هُوَ الْوَسَطُ فِي الْأَخْلَاقِ دُونَ الطَّرَفَيْنِ. And he's saying, and the evidence for the fact that what is desirable is to have moderation in your character, and not to have two different extremes, is that أن السخاء خلق محمود شرعا. He says that generosity is a virtue that is praised in the Sharia, in religion, by revelation. And it is wasatun, it is the moderation بين الطرفين, between two extremes, which is التبذير والتقتير, which is excessive spending or wastage, and miserliness on the other end. And then he gives a Quranic ayah to demonstrate it. وَقَدْ أَثْنَى اللَّهُ تَعَالَى عَلَيْهِ فَقَالَ وَالَّذِينَ إِذَا أَنفَقُوا لَمْ يُسْرِفُوا وَلَمْ يَقْتُرُوا وَكَانَ بَيْنَ ذَلِكَ قَوَامًا. And he says that he cites a revelation in Quran, and he says that those who do not spend, those who spend, they do so by not doing in excess, but not also being deficient, and they are in between, in moderation, that they established a sense of moderation. So I just want to demonstrate that as a vehicle of showing us how Imam al-Ghazali is taking this nature versus nurture dialogue and the notion of moderation and bringing it to the dialogue and using reason, empiricism, and wahi in proving his point. To further illustrate the point, Imam al-Bajuri, who's a later stage mutakallim, a scholastic theologian, he does a summary to describe the different positions with regard to the notion or the localization of aql, mind, age-old mind-body debates. So where is this mind, aql? And by the way, he's referring to as metaphysics, right? This notion of this mind, not what operates the human being, gives it reason. And he summarizes their perspectives, and he says, وَاخْتَلَفَ فِي مَحَلِّهِ, where it is situated and located has been disputed, has been debated. وَالصَّحِيحُ أَنَّهُ مَحَلَّهُ الْقَلْبِ وَلَهُ نُورٌ مُتَّصِلٌ بِالدِّمَاغِ كما ذهب إليه الإمام الشافعي والإمام المالك وجمهور المتكلمين. It's just really amazing that they were having these dialogues. Sometimes if we don't know, we can't appreciate all the richness of dialogue they've been having. He says that the most correct position is that its location is the metaphysical heart, not the physical, the metaphysical qalb, the aql, the mind. And he says, but he deals with the question of, wait a minute, what about the brain though? Because we know empirically that the brain plays a role in cognition, right? In cognitive processes. So it says, but there is a nur, a light, a metaphysical light that is connected with the brain, which means that the mind or the metaphysical heart operates the brain, okay? And brain belongs to the body. And this is what Imam al-Shafi'i said, Imam Malik, and majority of the mutakallimin. Then he says, sorry, the screen is being blocked up. And he says, وَقَالَتُ الْحُكَمَا وَبَعْضُ الْفُقَهَا, and we can also appreciate the diversity, by the way. He says that some of the jurists and some of the physicians, they have said, بِأَنَّ مَحَلَّهُ الدِّمَاغ. They said that the place of it is in the physical brain. This metaphysical aql is in the physical brain. لِفَسَادِهِ بِفَسَادِ الدِّمَاغ. I want you to pay attention to how they're reasoning here. I'm demonstrating how they're reasoning. They're saying, no, its location is physically in the brain. Why? Because when the brain becomes corrupted, if you get brain damage, so does your cognitive processes. Therefore, it must be in the brain. Why am I saying this? Because the Quran, right, talks about the qulub in which they do thinking, aql. Okay, so in the Quran, there's a mention of the hearts and usage of the hearts in order to reflect and have cognitive processes. So they are saying, how do we figure this out? They didn't just dump it. They didn't just dump empirics. And they said, you know what? Quran says aql is in the heart and we're just going to dump anything to do with empirics here. The idea of brain and whatever, you know, we don't know, we're not going to deal with that issue. No, they started to reason. They said, how can we understand this? Because we do know that the brain has cognitive processes, but we also know that the Quran is talking about a metaphysical aql that's located in the heart. So how do we make sense of this? Some of the fuqaha said there's no problem with saying that the metaphysical aql is located in the dimag. They don't have a problem with that. However, those who took the position that it's in the heart, they said, وَهَذَا لَا يَدُلُّ عَلَى مَا ذَكَرُوهُ. And they said, this doesn't necessarily prove that point, because it's possible لِجَوَازِ أَن تَكُونَ سَلَامَةَ الدِّمَاغِ شَرْطًا لِإِسْتِمْرَارِهِ وَإِنْ كَانَ مَحَلَّهُ الْقَلْبِ. And he says that because we are not saying that the brain doesn't have any role. What we are saying is that the heart is the locus of it, and it has a connection with the brain. And if the brain doesn't function, then the aql or the qalb cannot execute its cognitive motivations or energies over the body. Okay, just like if you have you know, a disability in your arm, you cannot tell your arm to do something because there's a dysfunction in the arm. Okay, it doesn't mean that, you know, motor you know, response or action is stored in the arm. Actually comes from the brain, right? So that's kind of what he is talking about. I just want to demonstrate that. One or two things, and then I'm going to stop because we want to go short in our discussions. Imam al-Ghazali also takes the conversation a little bit further, this relationship with body and metaphysics. And this is really important because we want to appreciate the fact that we cannot accept a secular psychology. We cannot accept a material psychology. And our tradition has talked about psychology in a very holistic way. And we want to preserve that holism. And that happiness cannot come without happiness of the heart, the happiness of the metaphysical entity, right? And so Imam al-Ghazali demonstrates this, where he says, وَجُمْلَةُ السَّعَادَةِ فِي ذَلِكَ. And happiness, the summary of happiness is in this. أَيَجْعَلَ لِقَاءَ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى مَقْصَدَهُ. That he makes his objective in life to meet Allah Ta'ala. وَالدَّارُ الْآخِرَةِ مُسْتَقَرَّهُ. And his permanent abode and station to be the akhirah, the hereafter. وَالدُّنْيَا مَنْزِلَهُ. And the dunya, a temporary station. وَالْبَدَنْ مَرْكَبَهُ. And the body, his vehicle. He's using this analogy of getting to the akhirah, but using the vehicle of your body. وَالْأَعْضَاءَ خَدَمَهُ. And your limbs as its servants. And I want to jump down. And he says, a little bit here. فيستقر, actually just continue on. ويستقر هو أعني المدرك من الإنسان في القلب. And he says, and that the mudrika min al-insan, that reason that is stored in the heart, which is الذي هو وسط مملكته كالملك, which is the centrality of his kingdom, just like the king, that he establishes his heart as the king of his dominion. ويجرى القوة الخيالية المودعة في مقدم الدماغ. مجرى صاحب بريده. He says that, and this Malik, this heart, establishes and uses the faculty of reason, the faculty of thinking and imagination, which he says is located, the faculty of reasoning, not the heart, right? He says the heart is the heart, but it uses your limbs, it uses your brain. And he says the faculty of reason, the faculty of imagination is located at the front of your brain, في مقدم دماغه مجرى صاحب بريده, as the a director of communication. إذ تجتمع أخبار المحسوسات عنده. Since all sensory information is gathered at that place. Now I want to pause for a moment to say, perhaps the Muqaddam al-Dimagh was a little bit off in Ghazali's time with regard to localization of where this is in the brain based upon today's science, which is fine because he's, they're using the science of their time to discuss these issues, right? There's no problem with that. There can be, they're not saying that this came from Wahi, this came from Quran. They're using the science of their time to have this dialogue about the human being. But the point is, he's saying that in fact, it's in the thalamus, right? That's where all of the sensory information is gathered, right? But it's very interesting that he is referring to the brain as cognitive and executive functioning as being linked to this metaphysical essence, and that he uses this body and brain as a tool. Like the Malik, the king, is the heart, and it uses the body in order to attain its satisfaction. And what is ultimate satisfaction? To reach Allah Ta'ala. And he says, وَقَمْعِ عَدُوِّهِ, so he's using reason in order to deal with his enemies, هُوَ مُبْتَلًا بِهِ وَدَفْعِ قَوَاطِعِ الطَّرِيقِ عَلَيْهِ, and to move any of the blocks in the way. فإذا فعل ذلك كان موفقا سعيدا شاكرا نعمة الله تعالى. And if he does this, then he is been given divine grace, he's successful, and he will be happy, and he will be demonstrating gratitude for the bounties of Allah Ta'ala of giving him these limbs. There's one thing I want to talk about, and then I will stop here, inshallah. There's a lot actually that I have. I just want to talk about this. And that is that Imam al-Ghazali as talking about going to somebody for treatment, right? Qala, and he starts with this in his Ihya, and he says that Qala sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, إِذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ بِعَبْدِهِ خَيْرًا بَصَّرَهُ بِعُيُوبِ نَفْسِهِ. That if Allah Ta'ala wants good for a slave, that he will give him awareness of his deficiencies. وَلِهَذَا ولهذه المعرفة طرق أعلاها أن يجلس بين يدي الشيخ من مشايخه. And that one of the ways to do this is to take on a traditional sheikh, right? A spiritual mentor. فيشتغل بما يأمره فعند ذلك ينكشف له تارة وتارة يكشف له شيخه. And he take him on, and that he listen to what he says, and sometimes he will become aware of his own intrapsychic tensions by himself, and sometimes the sheikh will make him aware. And then I want to draw our attention to this part. وطريقا أخرى, and there's another modality. أن يطلب رفيقا صالحا عالما بأسرار هذا الأمر. And the other avenue is to take on a authoritative peer who is God conscious, who is pious, who is an expert in this matter. What matter? In showing you your deficiencies, okay? And to achieve self-awareness that way. So I want to show you the notion of going to somebody and seeking support is established in our tradition. Imam al-Razi does the same thing. He talks about the need to rely in this matter on a wise person who's always his associate and companion, asking him to be informed about all the vices he knows of him and tell him that so that he will be able to advise him. So this is where I'm going to stop here because the next few slides I have is just on the future, inshallah. But just as a demonstration of the Islamic intellectual heritage, obviously I had a lot more and certainly planned to do a little bit more, but inshallah, you get the point. The idea was to sort of give you a little bit of a flavor. I'm just going through these slides a little bit just to show you that there's a lot, like this idea of can you quiet the mind, thought stopping. Imam al-Ghazali talks about this. He talks about a thought action theory. And so I just wanted to demonstrate that there's so much richness in the Islamic intellectual heritage for us to be able to draw upon and to bring and enrich modern psychology through this classical Islamic heritage. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Thank you so much, Hojam. As you said, it is quite wide topic. Even it's just includes the past of Islamic psychology, the past form of it. So now we are going to move on the contemporary movements. Basically, what's going on nowadays, currently. So, Dr. Abdullah Rahman, please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair. Thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be here, and it's good to see, like Dr. Human said, such a wide reach beyond just the university in Istanbul. I think in this recent past, this has been a benefit and the barakah in bringing people together. So alhamdulillah to see so many people here, especially students. It's great to see young students getting involved. So building off of what Dr. Human is talking about, I think I have to apologize because I think we all probably would have preferred to listen to him go through the rest of those slides. I think that looks like it was a whole course on Islamic psychology rather than a dip into the field in general. And so this is what I'm going to do is much less detailed and in depth. But I think what's really beautiful about what Dr. Human just demonstrated is the sophistication with which our Islamic tradition dealt with psychology. And that really, now what I want to talk about is from that point, when all that work was happening in the early, 9th to 13th centuries, the level of sophistication that was happening around what we're now calling Islamic psychology, but was a conglomeration of all these different aspects of Islamic knowledge that was whole, and it had everything there. And now the story that I'm going to sort of tell about where we come to now is, to be honest, it's sort of catching up with the past, is what I would say. We fell out of that knowledge sort of collectively as a human species, but also in the Muslim community. And now it's the story of coming back to that knowledge, but not just going back to it, but trying to bring it into the present, to our contemporary world. But we have to understand that, like Dr. Human was pointing out, is that these scholars, these classical scholars, we're on a different level than most of us today, right? And the people even higher than us today, is that they were polymaths, but they were also, there was such a high level of sophistication in the way that they dealt with these things. And so we have this treasure trove to learn from, and it's now about bringing it into where we are into reality. And so looking at the 20th century, really, from the early 1900s, is when it came back on the scene of people thinking about psychology, or even Islam and psychology, basically because psychology only around that time became a field in and of itself with this word psychology. And between sort of the Imam Ghazali was around the 12th century, and up until the 20th century, that's a big gap of time. It's not that nothing was happening during that time. There was a lot of work in Turkey in the Ottoman era with the Dar al-Shifa, and there was a lot of work in Iran of development of sort of reaching into those classical scholarship, but putting it into practice. But that was mostly happening in localized regional places. And there wasn't the sort of time period that Dr. Human was referencing, these scholars, there was so much thought around this development that there was there was really a thought leadership and a thought movement during this time when it became, people were doing things like the Ihya al-Ulumuddin with these magnum opus of contributions. And that sort of, there was a lull in the period of time. And then as people started to talk about this field of psychology in the West, that became imported into the Muslim world. And around, probably 1960s, or 50s, when Muslims started to get trained in Western psychology, these Western theories were imported to the Muslim world. And there was this engagement in this clash of, okay, well, now there's this field, this secular field of psychology. And as Muslims trying to wrap our heads around what that is and what that means, very much mostly removed from the tradition of Islam and the Islamic intellectual heritage that contains already all of this knowledge of sophisticated knowledge of psychology. And so, there's a lot to uncover of what was happening there. A lot of it is about, post-colonialism and the need for Muslims to try to adopt Western attitudes and the Western science and the Western academy to feel legitimate. And so what happened is there was sort of a taking on of this secularized version of definitions of the human being and understanding of the mind and psychology and mental health that was really removed from any spiritual ontology. And it was really about science. It was about studying the human being from this empirical notion. And as Dr. Human was saying, that existed in the Islamic approach to psychology originally, but it existed also with wahi, with the revelation sciences and rationality, but this paradigm that involves this unseen reality of Allah and the afterlife. And so when this started to happen, that Muslims were learning this secular version of psychology that is removed from this spirituality, there inevitably became a question of sort of dissonance of how do I maintain my Muslim identity and be a psychologist that looks at the human being in this completely removed way, removed from this belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so there was a lot of scholars dealing with this in different areas and countries. For instance, even before Professor Malik Badri, there was Muhammad Uthman Najati in Egypt, who did a lot of work in the development of psychology around the same time, but before Professor Malik. But Muhammad Najati wrote only in Arabic and very much sort of stayed within this Muslim world. And the thing that's so significant about Professor Malik is that because of his international travel, he was educated in the UK, he spoke English, he taught in the University of Beirut, in the American University in Beirut. He traveled all over the world. And so because of this global influence, Professor Malik becomes this spokesperson for this notion that, hey, we need to look at psychology from our Islamic tradition and from this lens of our belief as Muslims, and not to sort of sell out who we are as believers. And so he was really speaking against this, sort of the dangers for Muslims to completely divorce themselves from their identity as Muslims, but not just culturally, really rooted in this notion of the Islamic ontological and epistemological roots, and drawing back on realizing, hey, there is this tradition of ilm an-nafs, and it's not something that we have to just take on from the West. But what happened is that even though Professor Malik in 1979, this book, The Dilemma of Muslim Psychologists, came out, when he was really putting these ideas forward. And even though he was saying, look, we need to come back to this roots from the ground up of an Islamic paradigm of psychology, the Muslim world really wasn't ready for that message at that point. And there was such a pushback that he received of people really being offended because they were holding on to this notion of, well, we want to be scientists. We want to be seen by the Western Academy. And so his ideas weren't very popular. And so what happened is he began to talk more about Muslim psychology, because that's what people were ready to listen to and ready to hear, even though his message was about Islamically grounded psychology. It was a little bit ahead of his time. And so what he did is he sort of allowed, he sort of met people where they were at. And this is where this Islamization of psychology was the approach for many years. And this, to some degree came out of the Islamization movement, which was happening in other areas of academia and knowledge. But even this term Islamization, the original ideas of that, there's sort of different camps of Islamization. The original ideas of that can actually be considered somewhat similar to what we talk about when we're talking about an indigenous psychology. However, what became more popular was this notion of just sort of adapting the Western science with some Islamic principles. And so a lot of work was around this area of Islamizing Western psychology rather than going back to our roots of the Islamic tradition. And I wanted to, before I jump to the 21st century, just to make a note that a lot of, when we talk about the history of Islamic psychology, a lot of what we tend to reference is things that were written in English. We have to recognize that there's tons of work happening, especially in Turkey, and things written in Turkish and things in Farsi in Iran and in all over the Muslim world in Arabic, but because they stay in those languages, they didn't get widespread awareness. And so it didn't become part of this movement of Islamic psychology. So when we're talking about this sort of global movement, because of the English language being able to go across different regions, this is why this became more of a trajectory. And so I think it's important for us to start to understand the other developments that were happening in countries that were not writing in English. And so part of that, in an effort to do that, myself and Dr. Amber Hawk have edited a book called Islamic Psychology Around the Globe that will be, inshallah, coming out in about a month from now, or maybe after Ramadan. And there's 17 chapters in this book, and these are the countries that all these chapters are representing. And it's really looking at what was happening, what was going on in these things that we don't hear about because much of it was in the local languages. And so this is really important that we don't sort of, that the English language doesn't dominate like often, sort of going back to that idea of colonialism. Ironically, though, as we were writing this book and editing this book and reading all these developments, it's really fascinating that you hear Malik Badri's name mentioned in all of these chapters. In almost every single one of these chapters, the impetus for moving in this direction, or at some point a big turn taking, they mentioned being influenced by Malik Badri's work. And it just shows that he had this global reach and really started to galvanize a movement. And so what happened is, moving sort of towards the 21st century, Professor Malik, because he was teaching all over the world, he was teaching in Malaysia for quite a long time, in Pakistan, in Sudan, in Lebanon, in many places, Turkey. He was in Istanbul in the last part of his life before he died. Allah have mercy on him. And during that time, he has this global network of students that are starting to develop this work, and primarily for a long time just in the Muslim world. And again, very much his students tended to focus on this Islamization, even though he was really, if you go back to one of the things that was really fascinating in his work in Sudan, there's all of this work that he was doing in Sudan because he had more freedom there, I think, and the people were more receptive to it, is that his work is really grounded in an Islamic approach. It wasn't cultural adaptation, but the work he was doing in the rest of the world, primarily in Malaysia, was about this Islamization. But it started to take a shift as people began to become more aware of this dynamic. And so I think what happens is, in the West, in the UK and the US primarily, there's this emergence of spiritually integrated therapies. And people start to have this awareness of bringing the spiritual and religious back into psychology. And there becomes this sort of Islam and psychology movement in the early 2000s, and a lot of developments come out of that. And this is when Professor Malik had organized and started and founded the International Association of Islamic Psychology. Even though he had the International Association of Muslim Psychologists before, he realized that now it's time to move into this, what he was always talking about, and this grounded approach, what he called emancipation. And so moving towards this direction. And so if you look at Dr. Human and I and our colleagues, Fahad Khan and Amber Haq, in 2016 did this paper where we looked at the themes of research that were happening in this time when there was sort of more than usual work happening and adding to the literature in English in Islamic psychology. And we came with these 5 themes. And these 2 themes were lacking the most. So there was a lot of work on people sort of making the connections between Western psychology and Islam. And this is what Professor Malik talked about in his book, that people are trying to reconciliation, the stage of reconciliation, and then going back and looking at historic accounts. But it was these 2 themes of developing theoretical frameworks and interventions that really were lacking and needed. And then after this paper was published, now there actually happened to be some more frameworks coming out around that time. And now we're in the stage where people are starting to really focus on interventions and techniques. And I think that we had to establish, well, what are we talking about from an Islamic psychology? You can't just jump into assuming that we know what we're talking about. If what happens is we sort of take on the Western foundation, and instead of building from the ground up. And so this is now where the field is starting to move more into, is this Islamically integrated psychotherapy, taking on this term from the West of spiritually integrated psychotherapy. And so these 2 books, the first, Islamically Integrated Psychotherapy, came out, and it was basically an account of people and what they're doing in their own practice. Not necessarily any formal thing, but these are the different ways that people are starting to integrate. And then now, just last year, Dr. Human and his colleagues at Khalil Center put out this book that is moving much more in the direction of an actual framework for how do we do this in practice. And so this is really the movement now. And as people need to know, well, what does this look like? And how do we do it in the context of what we know as contemporary psychology, versus, when we can look back at the classical scholars, there wasn't this field, there wasn't this, all of the dynamics of what it means in the modern context to do this work is very different. And so we can't just say, okay, well, let's go back to that and just do what they were doing, because that's not a reality. We have to understand it in the context of the fact that there is this collective consciousness in our world where people understand psychology and psychotherapy. So it's working within that frame, but doing it in a way that really honors the Islamic tradition. And so it's a challenge, and it's something that people do differently. there's different approaches to this. And I think there's room for all of these different approaches because we're still in this place of understanding how to do it, and there's different needs. And so there's some people that are still sort of taking this Western, their Western training and bringing Islam into it in this sort of what Professor Malik called reconciliation. And then there's taking Western approaches and filtering it through an Islamic filter, which is sort of this top-down approach where you take what you know and say, well, there's room for Islam to fit into it. We don't have to completely change the thing from the ground up. And then there's really what we're calling what I call indigenous Islamic approaches that is taking back from these classical scholarly work and understanding from the ground up how we understand the human being and human nature, and even treatment approaches that we learn from Islamic medicine and the Hikmah tradition and all of this integration of knowledge. And these are there's fewer of these types of approaches being developed because it really requires a certain mastery of the knowledge. So I'm gonna skip some of this. I think Dr. Human talked about this, is like this, again, this idea, this sophistication of understanding the biological study of the brain and making sense of this, the soul, and that oftentimes what happens is when we use this word psychology, people assume that it means what it has meant for the past, 100 years or so in the Western academy. And it can become very experimental and very biological. And so understanding how does that play with philosophy? And so there's room for both, just like there was, as Dr. Human demonstrated, in this sophistication of understanding how is the physicality is really a manifestation of the unseen and the soul. All right, I'm going to skip ahead and just say that, as we move on, there's more and more models. So this is something, in 2013, Dr. Human and Dr. Amber Hawk put this model out, and now things are starting to get more sophisticated. TIIP is building on this foundational framework and understanding what are the principles of change and what does that look like in psychotherapy. I don't know, this might be an old version, Dr. Human, I'm not sure, but no, that's good. And this is a model that I put together, my research, that is understanding the structure of the soul, and then also understanding ways of how does that look in psychotherapy and translating it into what are the dynamics for actually doing this and putting this into practice. And so it is about going back to our classical tradition, but it's bringing it into modern context and understanding it in relationship to the Western model, because that's where we're working in, and that's what people know. And it's really important that we have a grasp of both. And it's really important as we start to develop this role of the Islamic therapist that we are able to define that scope, because it can get somewhat messy when we're mixing religion and psychology. And so it's really important that clinicians have spiritual and religious training so that people are grounded in the knowledge and understand what this means, where it's coming from, and not just to sort of bring in these concepts of that are rooted in our theology without understanding how they play into, because really what happens there is a level of spiritual guidance that's coming into this. You can't, if we were to leave that out completely, then we wouldn't be talking about Islamic psychotherapy. We'd be talking about just helping people sort of cope with life. And so it's sensitive, and we have to treat it sensitively. So we need, this is, I think, what we'll focus on in this talk on the future, is developing training and having that really be at a high standard because of the importance of this, and making sure that if, ideally that people have dual training, and if they don't, that there's partnerships with religious scholars, and that we start to create ethical standards for this because of the sensitivity and importance of it. So I'll stop there, and inshallah we can carry on the conversation about the future.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah. Allah razı olsun. And now, inshallah, we'll have the future part, what maybe we can help in the future, inshallah. Yani. And both our doctors, Dr. Human and Dr. Abdullah, will guide us through that part. The floor is yours, both of them.
Jazakumullah khair, Dr. Rothman. That was wonderful, kind of picking up on the heritage and bringing us to today, and what's going on in the modern context, and giving tribute to our esteemed and beloved mentor, Dr. Badri, who planted the seeds, and we're eating from the fruit of the tree that he established. In looking at the future, there's just a couple of things, because I think Dr. Rothman also essentially started the process of going into the future, and so I'd like to hear from him as well, for him to kind of finish his thoughts on the future. I just want to kind of bring this up, just if you remember what I talked about with regard to virtue and character as being an important part in metaphysics, being an important part of the psychology of those who came before us in the classical tradition, and then Dr. Badri and recent Muslim, scholars and Islamic psychologists that are really trying to bring the qalb and heart and character back into a sort of a materialistic psychology. We're starting to see that some of those movements also shifting in mainstream psychology, one of which is a movement on positive psychology headed by Dr. Seligman. Now, I have my own critiques of this, but I just want to show this. He has this book called Character, Strengths, and Virtues, in which he actually goes through and cites the history of Muslims, ancient Greeks and Muslims, in talking about works on tahdhib al-akhlaq, on akhlaq and akhlaq development, on character development. And they highlight these virtues, 4 of which are the principal virtues that Imam al-Ghazali discussed and correspond with many of the virtues and the way in which the ancient Greeks talked about them. So Imam al-Ghazali did a continuity. He took, right, from the ancient Greeks, which was valid knowledge according to empirical and rational sources. And then he also brought it together with wahi. But 4 of the sources are taken by the positive psychology movement: wisdom, iffa, which is temperance; justice, adl, and moderation, which is iffa; and courage, shuja' in Arabic. Okay, and then Imam al-Ghazali says these are the 4 major ones, and then there's multiple like sub-virtues that come underneath each of these. But sometimes, it takes somebody else to cite our own tradition to kind of wake us up. You see, Martin Seligman is talking about akhlaq, right? And he's like this figurehead of positive psychology, and he's looking at the Muslims and he's saying, you guys have this rich heritage. I don't see you talking about it. So let me talk about it, And so, they know oftentimes, it's like we don't know our tradition, unfortunately, until somebody else tells us that we have it, unfortunately. And so that's why it's important for us to really extract what we have. Here is kind of my proposed sort of model, not the bottom-up approach, as Dr. Rothman talked about, is the Islamic psychology knowledge production framework. This is what I propose. We do a literature review of the Islamic psychology research and tradition, right? Then we are doing a literature review. And so we're drawing out like just what I did a sample of, extracting all of the stuff from our tradition. We review the current behavioral science literature. We critically analyze that behavioral science literature through an Islamic lens. What I mean to say by that, by usage of our own epistemology and grading of knowledge. Not all empirical knowledge is the same, right? We have correlational data that are very weak. We have DSM categories that are very socially constructed, and some that are very strong in terms of their empirical basis. So we need to look at that. We need to look at philosophies, analogies, ideas in modern psychology, and be able to look at how much of that can we bring in? And we can look at Imam al-Ghazali as an example of that. He took the idea of the metaphors, he took the idea of i'tidal, he took the idea of treatment with opposites. There's a number of things that he took and he measured them against, as Dr. Badri says, the Furqan. The Furqan is the Quran and Sunnah. Measure them against our tradition, right? And then we have this integrated knowledge production at the end, right? We have this integration of these two spaces in the modern Islamic psychology movement. The other thing I will add is that any form of knowledge, whenever we say it's Islamic, right? When we say something is Islamic, it has to be informed by the core Islamic sciences. You can put anything into this circle here. I have mental health here. You can put law, you can put economics, you can put social science, sociology, whatever, politics, you put it in there. It should be informed by these three. Specifically for our field of mental health or psychology, we can look at this circle is informed by these three. How? I'll just give you a concrete demonstration. The first is that al-fiqh al-akbar, which is kalam and aqidah, our belief system. So in this literature, we see the discussions of our epistemology, that we accept empiricism, we accept wahi, and we accept reports, strong reports, and we accept rational reasoning. And this, and that they're graded according to qat'i and dhanni, right? They're graded, knowledge production is graded in their strength, in our ability to use it. Then the placement of dreams, those are subjective data, or internal experiences and insights. Those are other data sources. Our creed gives us this ability to navigate this field, okay? And that we make sure that it's within metaphysical assumptions, right? And a belief in the akhirah. Like, for example, the ethics, which is now, we'll come to the fiqh al-zahir, is more of your ethics, right? This is what we think of in fiqh, like halal and haram. Also the ethics of you as a physician, that you, is it ethical for you to charge people? If so, what about differentiating between one person and another? Is it ethical for you to practice psychology without you knowing psychology? Like there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, "Man tatabbaba fahuwa laysa bi alimin bil-tibbi fahuwa damin." Right? And this is our ethics. We have our whole ethics. That whosoever practices medicine and they don't have knowledge of medicine, then they're liable for any damages that they do. And our fuqaha took these and they started to talk about it. Adab al-Tabib, written by Ishaq al-Ruhawi, right? Looking at our tradition and informing the ethics of our practice. Then there's a fiqh al-batin. Fiqh al-batin is our Sufism and tasawwuf. And perhaps this is the greatest convergence between modern psychology and our tradition. And sorry, this core Islamic tradition. And this is where there's a lot of overlap of us being able to take interventional strategies that they have, including dhikr and behavioral and cognitive and emotional strategies to be able to reform the human being. I didn't get a chance to really demonstrate it much, right? But if I just run back to a slide, just for the purposes of this, here, طرق علاج الخلق خلق المذموم, right? This is the way to be able to treat despicable character. Okay, and he has all of this. He says, becoming aware of your sicknesses, its triggers, its causes, its opposites, its benefits, its sources, then uncovering it. And then later on, after you do the self-assessment, you do a positive opposites and exertion. These are interventions that he's talking about, right? This was in Imam al-Birgivi. So I needed to mention Imam al-Birgivi. We are in Istanbul. This is the Ibn Khaldun talk. We should not, fall short of mentioning the great Ottoman ulama and scholarship that existed in these lands and continues to do so. And then lastly, the institutional settings in our Islamic psychology that we need to, I think, enliven. The tasawwuf The spiritual lodge, the khanqa, the zawiya models need to also inform our mental health models, our mental health clinics. We need to look at those settings, and I'm not saying we're just replacing those settings, right? We're not replacing the khanqa, the zawiya, the taqiyya, but rather we need to derive inspiration for the fact that these were spiritual healing centers, right? And so if we're going to do a psychology that is spiritually integrated and informed, we need to also think about and look at how they used to do it in those models, in addition to how they used to do it in our tradition. Because look at this. These are living buildings here in Istanbul. I encourage you to come and visit for those who aren't here. This is the Darul Shifa in the Sultan Selim Jami's complex, right, in Edirne. And then on this right side is where my office is actually located, by the way, today. I work out of this office. This is a picture of an ancient 300-year-old spiritual lodge, a tekke, Uzbekler tekkesi. Okay, and I work out of this. It's been revived as like a research center in which also religious activity takes place. They also, as an aside, serve Uzbeki pilau, which is like 300-year-old custom, out of pots that are 100 years old, by the way. So just want to throw that in there. But last thing I want to talk about the future, for the students. There are students and there are professionals that are here. And we just finalized this, by the way, and I want to announce it. Is that, I myself am a fellow at the International Association for Islamic Psychology, in which it is under the executive leadership of Dr. Rothman. Our institute, Khalil Center, is accredited by the IAIP, and they also accredit our training, which means that if you do a level 1 TIIP training, in which he showed an illustration of, and we have recently published a book on, we are doing a level 1 training, right, for psychotherapists. They can come and guess where it's being held? It's a pretty amazing experience, inshallah. If you want to join us, it'll be at the historic Suleymaniya Madrasa complex. Okay, we'll have 2 segments: the Dar al-Qurra building and the Madrasa. I think it was the Madrasa Salis building, right? I believe it is. And so there is right adjacent the historic Suleymaniya. So myself, I will be there. Dr. Fahad will also come out from the US. Dr. Summer, Dr. Asim Yusuf will come from the UK. And then Dr. Rajab will give opening remarks. And then our religious consultant, Maulana Bilal from the US, will also join us to talk about mental illness in Islamic law and talk about more of these fiqh categories and how they relate to mental health practice and how to do religious collaboration between people. So this is our model, level 1. We have 3 levels. The second level is also in person that will launch after this. The third one is more of a supervision. Okay, so it's not really a classroom structure. But we're doing this in partnership with Ibn Khaldun and Khalil Center. So it's August 9th to 13th, and we will have scholarships available as well for those who cannot afford to pay for the tuition to join this program, inshallah. And it will be held in English, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakumullahu khairan. I'll pass it off to Dr. Rothman to speak about the future from his perspective and where we need to go, inshallah.
Exciting developments, mashallah. It's good to see this happening. I think I don't have much time, unfortunately. I have to go in about 7 minutes or so. But so instead of talking about the future in general, I'll just sort of add to that things are happening. Like, our vision and our dream of all these opportunities for people to actually get training are starting to happen. Like, and it's amazing how it happens with this momentum, as if like Allah is opening the doors for this to happen. Not as if, Allah is opening the doors for this to happen. So I don't have any slides yet because we haven't announced it officially, but next, in about 2 weeks, we're announcing that at Cambridge Muslim College, we're offering a diploma in Islamic psychology. and that will be online, fully online program. And then in person following this, it's a year-long academic year, 9 months, and it goes through the roots of Islamic psychology from the classical tradition into the period of modernity, and understanding the interaction with psychology and trying to understand what is our Islamic perspective, and then talking about integration in psychotherapy and social psychology and lifespan development from an Islamic perspective. And then after that program, people will be eligible for certification, IAIP certification, with an in-person intensive training held in Cambridge the summer of 2022, inshallah. And so these are some really exciting developments. And also in the next, like I mentioned, this book, Islamic Psychology Around the World, this will come out, we'll be using it as a textbook on these diploma, as well as we're republishing Dr. Amber Haq and Yasin Muhammad's really amazing book that's been out of print for so long, Psychology of Personality, Islamic Perspectives. IIP is publishing this book, and as well as Yasin Muhammad's book on Fitra, which has also been out of print and really a gem for the Islamic psychology literature. So I think the future is really the present, like the future that we've been looking forward to is unfolding before us. And I think it's coming. There's textbooks, there's training courses, there's education. I think it's really an exciting time, mashallah. So maybe I can, I don't know if Dr. Human, if you can stay longer, but I can only stay for like another 5 minutes or so. So if there's questions, I'm happy to try to answer questions.
Yeah, I think we should try to wrap up around, Maghrib here anyways. So I would defer to the organizers. Sister Hiba, do you have any thoughts? Is that doable? Maybe we can make questions via email to us or something of that sort. What are your thoughts?
Sure, Jim. First of all, I'd like to make a small comment, because in the introduction, I forgot to say, my bad, that Dr. Abdullah Ruthman is the executive director of the International Association of Islamic Psychology, which is also a huge, entity. It's more focused on research, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Ruthman, and Khalil Center is more focused on practical psychotherapy, and both are huge entities. So as both doctors have been saying, we're exactly like, we're in front of two pioneers, to be honest. Like, I can say that confidently. And Malik Badri also, alayhi rahmatullah, he was also the start point in terms of like global expansion, let's say. So we were very, very glad to have you both, both Dr. Human and Dr. Uthman. Thank you very much for coming. And as for that was my small comment. As for the questions, I mean, Hujam, whether you have like,
there's a specific question to Dr. Uthman, if it's possible, I can ask.
Yeah, sure, Fatma Zahra, if you can ask that question.
It was directly Dr. Uthman. It is that, do you see any differences in the different works from the different Muslim countries when it comes to the field of Islamic psychology? Is it different themes or different approach? Is it more work in Islamizing Western secular theories, or is it directly built as you from a ground up?
Well, that's a good question. We found that there's a pretty wide range, and most of it, a lot of it is happening in isolation, and a lot of it is happening without the term Islamic psychology. And so people are able to trace back, well, what are the things that are starting to happen in these local regions where you have indigenous Muslim populations that have traditional healing practices. And so there's, the shayukh that are doing traditional healing, there's traditional medicine happening. And so people are starting to understand and link these developments with things that are happening as people start to be trained in psychology and start to mix them. But in most of the countries, it's organic, and it's like not from this organized and formalized way. And in the places where it is organized and formalized, usually it's either not until people had contact with Malik Badri's work, and then they start to sort of be influenced and incorporate that. Or it is, like, so for instance, in the continental Europe chapter on continental Western Europe, there's mostly an approach of this top-down approach, where they're taking the tradition, because there's such a rooted tradition of psychology in that region, because that's where it essentially started from, right? This Western psychology in labs started there. And so there's a deeply rooted cultural orientation to it. And so they sort of assume that as the doctrine, and then they're sort of bringing Islam into it. Whereas in Muslim countries, it can also often be quite the opposite. So there's a big range. It's really good to see that range, because I think before this book, most people had no idea that these things were happening in these places. So it's going to be really important as students of Islamic psychology to understand the history of how this has developed.
Thank you, Ajam.
Thank you very much, Professor Abdullah. If you have to leave, I mean, I don't know about Dr. Himan. We have three main questions. We just summed all of them up to three main questions. One of which is coming from students or potential students who want to study Islamic psychology. Another is coming from individuals who have already studied psychology, who are practicing professionals, and they're asking for how they can implement more Islamic or integrate Islamic psychology more into their work.
Yep.
So these are main two questions, and I'll leave to you, Hujam, if you would like to mention even a little bit on them, and
Sure.
we can end up the program. So.
Sure, inshallah. First of all, I'm seeing a lot of questions about the TIIP summer training program. It's not available online at this time. It will be in person in Istanbul. We had a 6-part series. It is highly, highly encouraged that you take that, so that you we could pick up with concepts that people have already become familiar with in the 6-part series. So that we can maximize our time in person. So we highly recommend that, but at this time we're not requiring it as a prerequisite. It is targeted towards clinicians, so it's graduate students and existing psychologists or psychotherapists or healthcare professionals. So those who practice any form of mental health or are in the process of practicing mental health, that's who it's targeted towards in particular. This also includes like pastoral counselors or spiritual counselors, right? Like those are fine as well. They can all apply as well to join this program, inshallah.
Before I jump off, I'll just say it's basically the same thing for all of the IIP training as well as the CMC course. It's geared to people that have a foundation in some sort of foundation in some sort of therapeutic practice. We will accept applications for people who have something related, but the idea is that we're not yet at the point where you can sort of start from the ground up. You need to have some sort of base, and then it's like a specialization training. This is where we're at the moment, but inshallah, the field, I think, will, as it grows, will move to the point where people can start their entire career from this trajectory, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's nice to be with you.
Thank you so much, Ajam. It was really a great honor to have you also.
Just to mention, just to pick up on Dr. Rothman was saying, in terms of undergraduate students or those who are wanting to get more into Islamic psychology training, there's a couple of avenues. One is for those who are in Turkey. If you're at Ibn Khaldun, then take any of my classes that I'll be offering, inshallah, at Ibn Khaldun, because I'm teaching at least one class, right? On essentially what I did was I took pieces of what we're reading in depth and having greater conversations around and put it together for this particular slideshow. So if you want, this was like the trailer for the entire course, right? You can think of it. So if you're interested in in the entire course, then you can get that at Ibn Khaldun. And then for those in Turkey, and then for those who are non-Ibn Khaldun students that are in Turkey, then we are in the process of setting up open readings in Islamic psychology. So readings in Islamic psychology, classical Islamic readings, as it pertains to psychology. And that's something in the works. And I don't think that that'll be ready until the fall, inshallah. So it's anticipated that we'll be doing that in the fall. For those who are outside of Turkey, they are welcome to join any of Khalil Center's online programs, right? We are, Khalil Center, as much as we are a clinic, we're also a training center. We're a training clinic, research and training clinic. We are focused on psychology and application, certainly. And so through the Khalil School of Islamic Psychology and Research, if you go to our website, there's internship opportunities. So individuals can work on internship opportunities and learn along the way. And one of the benefits of that is that they join our every other week online classes that we hold, or didactics, trainings that we hold. So they get to kind of sit in and observe different topics and lectures in Islam and psychology as it pertains to psychotherapy in particular. Okay, so you can join the internship, whether you're in Istanbul, wherever you are, you can join to do the internships. You can certainly do your internship at Khalil Center directly if you're a graduate student. We have an accredited pre-doctoral training program. And if you were to do your graduate studies in Chicago, then you could also do your training, your clinical rotations and training, since we're an accredited training center at Khalil Center, to get more direct Islamic psychology application as well as learning as well. And the other thing is just to tune in to sign up to the Khalil Center mailing list, and by extension follow Ibn Khaldun's psychology club and work that we're doing, inshallah, because I think you're going to start to see a lot more of that activity. We're in the process of setting up a Center for Islamic Psychology through Ibn Khaldun that's more open, in partnership with Khalil Center, actually, and it'll be open to the world, inshallah. And we're hoping that if everything goes right, then this program, this TIAP program that we'll be doing in the summer, will be kind of the inaugurating program for the center in Istanbul as well, inshallah. So just stay connected, and you're welcome to email myself and anybody else, and just stay tuned and take advantage of the opportunities that are available to you. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you so much, Idam. If you have enough time, we can ask 2 more questions, if it's okay.
Sure, inshallah.
Okay. Actually, I have a question, and I saw some questions related to this. Should we think that the Islamic psychology kind of, or exact umbrella term, which includes the different subfields of psychology, for example? We already know that the clinical psychology, for example, we can see actually it's been doing its job in Islamic psychology. How about the neuropsychology, for example, or forensic psychology? As far as I know, you are working on forensic psychology related to Islamic psychology, right? And other subfields of psychology. I think it's important, because what we've seen is mostly related to clinical part of it. But I think, as a, for example, neuropsychologist, I can under the I should contribute, or as a developmental psychologist. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think these are, I didn't get a chance to talk about it in my slideshow, which I intended to do so. Actually, I make mention of this. Clinical psychology is getting a lot of work done in this area. And it's appropriate because of its application, right? Because we're serving people. There's people that are actually suffering, and you need some models and solutions that have practical manifestations for people's lives. And it's the largest kind of, area of psychology, I would say, of graduate psychology, and its demand. and study. But the other ones, developmental psychology, social psychology, these are still developmental, right? No pun intended. They're developmental in nature. So I think we need more and more models and more people doing that. Actually, Ibn Khaldun is opening, by the way, a PhD program in English in the psychology department. And it's a generalist, a PhD, a non-clinical degree. And so the idea is to pair them with academics and professors who would be able to observe and hopefully have them also have some sort of Islamic contributions in other fields as well. But certainly it's a limitation, current limitation of the field. There's work out there, but it's not nearly where clinical psychology is in terms of Islam and psychology movement.
But at least I think it's really nice to hear that something's going on. So
Absolutely.
for the last question, Hiba, if one can ask.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Jim, it's basically, we talked about the academic part of it, but there were questions of some people who are, inquiring about, what if I study Islamic psychology outside of academia? Can I study Islamic psychology outside of academia? If so, what are the resources that I can utilize?
Yeah, this is very difficult. I don't know how to answer that, to be quite honest. I'm not sure what that means out of the academy. If you want to study psychology, you need to do it with mentorship, and you need to do it in a setting in which there's an infrastructure and a setup for that. An individual, this isn't something that can be studied on their own. Of course, it is a very central pinnacle of the Islamic sciences that nothing is just kind of adopted on their own. They need mentorship, and we don't just read from books, but we get from people. But if you're referring to, more like classical madrasa systems, for example, I would encourage classical madrasa studies, right? Absolutely. It would certainly augment and enrich your study in psychology and give you a very, very strong foundation. But I also don't think that I think it's necessary, but insufficient, meaning that you still need to do some form of psychological study in order to, and there's, I don't know of any other way outside of the academy.
Thank you very much, Jim. We'll hopefully direct the other questions maybe through the email, and then, forward them back to the WhatsApp group we have, and maybe have another session in the future.
Inshallah.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much, Hijam, for your time and your answers. Yeah, as Hiba said, we need some more sessions because the field is quite wide. So maybe in the future. So thank you so much again. And for the participants, thank you for thanks for your time and patience for listening us.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.